In my last YouTube video, I did a spotlight on Raihan, the modern Elena player that qualified for Capcom Cup, and I got a question in the comments that I thought was interesting, which is this one down here from Nick Davis that says, "Would love to hear your thoughts about fighting against modern players sometime. You talked about how they don't often do the modern only stuff like one frame supers and anti-airs, but I think just the fact that they have access to these tools is a bigger deal. Especially as a character who can't alter their jump arc, I have to play very differently versus modern players than I would against normal. If you can't ever jump in on someone because they have guaranteed anti-air, then that adds a huge amount to your mental stack through finding another way to approach while making life even easier for your opponent because they don't have to worry about looking out for jumps." So, I thought today I'd offer you guys some tips from my own perspective and my own experience on how to fight and how to strategize against modern players, which can often require a very different approach to classic players. Obviously, modern players aren't all the same, so I can't ever say this will work 100% of the time. Everyone's different, but there are some habits that I've noticed that are quite consistent across modern players that I think could be useful to talk about. Before we start though, I'd really appreciate if you guys could subscribe, and let's get into the video. So, I need to start this with some tough love, and it's going to sound like I'm being kind of a jerk about this, but I need to be real with you guys very quickly, and I want to focus on this specific part. If you can't ever jump in on someone because they have guaranteed anti-airs, and I see this a lot, right? A common thing I see people saying is, I hate playing modern players because you just can't ever jump at them. They have this autopilot one-button anti-air. Why even bother jumping against modern players? And you need to think about the implication of what you're saying here. If you are saying, I can't ever jump at a modern player because they have an anti-air special like a one-button DP, you have to think, well, why am I getting away with jumps against classic players? Because that's kind of the underlying question underneath your main question. So, if you're able to jump against classic players, but you're failing to get jumps on modern players, what is the difference there? And the answer is, you are relying on your opponent fumbling their anti-air to get jump-ins. And when you go against modern players, suddenly, they don't fumble their anti-airs, which means that you are relying on your opponent making mistakes. So that means you are just up-forwarding at your opponent and taking advantage of your own opponent's flaws, and eventually, once you reach a certain level of play in this game, your opponents will have good anti-airs whether they're playing modern or classic. You're kind of scapegoating the modern a little bit, which is a common thing. So, when you jump at your opponent, and let me just switch over to the game. I've talked about this before, but when you jump at your opponent, you need to jump with intent. This is so important, and I want to highlight this once again. If you are going to up forward, there needs to be a reasoning behind it. Now, that reasoning could be a bunch of things, right? It could be, I'm predicting, for example, with Sagat here, it could be that I'm predicting that they're likely to throw a fireball at this range. So I'm hard reading a fireball, and I'm going to jump it. Maybe I'm trying to jump over, I don't know, a high recovery heavy normal, like Sagat's stand heavy punch. Again, that would be a hard read. And it's entirely fine if that read is incorrect. If I say to myself, based on my experience as a player, based on my matchup experience, based on reads I've gathered from my opponent, based on a bunch of factors, I'm making an informed decision to jump, and it doesn't work out, that's fine. As long as there was an intent behind the jump, I think that's fine. But it sounds like you're just jumping repeatedly at your opponent from a neutral position and hoping that the classic players are not yet at a level where they can consistently DP anti-air, but the modern players obviously do consistently DP anti-air, and you're kind of blaming modern for your own flaw. So, without wanting to say skill issue lol, that is the first thing to say. Anyway, with that being said, I just wanted to get that one out the way at the front because we need a bit of tough love sometimes. I'm going to give you guys some actual tips now that I think are useful for playing against modern players. So, number one, baiting modern reversals. So the first thing to say is that modern players often play very reactively, and they'll wait for you to do something. Often this includes things like one-button DPs, one-button supers. They play very reactively. And one thing you can do against modern players is you can take advantage of their own, like, Twitch reactions to punish them. So one thing I like to do is this. I'll be in a neutral position against a modern player, and I can see they're waiting for me to do something, and I'll do this. just tap parry. This doesn't achieve anything, right? Tap parrying doesn't actually do anything here, but a lot of the time, because the modern players are waiting for you to do something so they can react and like press their one button super, I've had lots of instances against modern players where they will just let rip like a level 2 or a level 3 just because they saw some kind of like flash of light. There's other stuff you can do here, like you can just whiff a jab, for example, or maybe like whiff a throw in the mid-range. Just stuff like this is quite good against modern players because they tend to be so hyper-focused on like responding to things like fireball, things like jumps, that they sometimes get a bit carried away. Another good thing you can do in this situation is Drive Rush. I think Drive Rush is actually really strong against modern players because, again, modern players tend to respond to sudden bursts of movement, and you got to keep in mind that you are actionable out of Drive Rush. So, for example, if you like Drive Rush and the modern player responds with a super, like this, in Aki's case, you can do EX Slide. In a more universal case, you can sometimes respond with your own super. Take advantage of their own sort of reactive playstyle and try and turn it against them. Okay, number 2 on my list is do your homework. And this is something that I myself have not done enough homework on, so I'm not going to say that I'm safe from this criticism. Do your homework. You need to familiarize yourself with the tools that a character is missing in Modern, because it can actually make a huge difference for matchup knowledge. And if you guys don't know how to find the difference between Modern and Classic, I'll just show you this real quick. So if you go to the Super Combo Wiki for Street Fighter 6, which is usually the first result in Google for most characters, and scroll down a little bit, right here, this is really useful. Every single character in the game has this Classic and Modern comparison. So for Ryu, for example, I can instantly see that Modern Ryu doesn't have stand medium kick or stand heavy kick, doesn't have back heavy punch, doesn't have these specials. It's a useful resource. And the reason that I really think it's useful to familiarize yourself with this stuff is because, like I said, it can actually have huge implications for a matchup. And one example I want to cite for you guys, and this actually happened at high level play, is Ed versus Bison. So if both of these characters are playing Classic, I think this matchup is actually okay for Ed. And one of the reasons why Ed does pretty good against Bison is this normal right here, crouch light kick. This is a 5-frame light with enormous range. One of the best lights in the game. And the reason this is so important against Bison is because Bison's scissors is -5 on block. So Ed is one of the most privileged characters in the game when it comes to punishing this. Whatever. You do your combo. So Ed has one of the best anti-scissors tools in the entire game. The Bison player has to space the scissors really well, or otherwise Ed can punish it. And that's a really important core aspect of this matchup. Now, if you guys don't know, Modern Ed does not have crouching light kick. If you play Modern, the Ed does not have access to this button, which completely changes a huge amount of this matchup, because the rest of Ed's normals, the rest of Ed's lights are a little bit stubby. And it goes from being like the best punish in the game on scissors to like some of the worst punishes in the game on scissors. Purely switching from Modern to Classic. So, and this actually matters in tournament. This came up because Tachikawa playing against Problem X, and Tachikawa is a Modern Ed player, one of the best Modern Ed players in the world, and Problem X was playing Bison, and Tachikawa actually switched off Ed and onto Manon because of how much he didn't like having to deal with not having crouch light kick against Bison. So yeah, it's a huge part of this matchup. And if you're the Bison player and you see the opponent is an Ed player and they're a Modern Ed player, you should say to yourself, that means I can be much more aggressive with the way that I use scissors, because Modern Ed does not have a good response to scissors in the way that Classic Ed does. So it's really important to familiarize yourself with this stuff. Sometimes you can find out that a normal or a special, which you find really obnoxious in a certain matchup, is actually missing, and it can completely change the outcome of the matchup. So yeah, do your homework. Next thing on my list for Modern tips is taking advantage of the ways that Modern causes tunnel vision. So I'm gonna give you guys a scenario. All right, so let's say that I'm the Aki player and I've got the Ryu player here in the corner in Burnout. And let's say that the Ryu player is a modern player. What would you guys do in this scenario? I send the DI. I mean, you can. I'm not saying don't ever DI against modern players because it can still work. But what I really like to do against burned out modern players in the corner is this. Walk up throw. And I find that walk up throw and throwing in general is actually very strong against modern players because modern players have a tendency, especially when they're in burnout, to hyper focus on responding to DI with their one button super. So many modern players will just be focused entirely on looking for this. That's all they're thinking about. They almost get too focused on the modern advantage. They're looking for the DI so intently that you can just walk up throw them a lot of the time. It's gotten to the point where sometimes I just don't even bother going for DIs against modern players and I just do walk up throw into throw loop. And they're just eternally waiting for a DI that is actually never going to come. So, yeah, I think throws are very good against modern players, especially when they're hyper-focused on looking for a DI while they're in burnout. Yeah, command grab is also good if your character has a command grab. Next up on my list is variable air movement options, and the original comment that started this segment did mention that they don't have aerial movement options, but it's worth mentioning regardless. So another kind of habit that modern players tend to fall into is that because they have things like a singular one-button DP, modern players don't tend to think very much about the precise timing of their DP. It tends to be much more just a case of see a jump and then do the DP special. They tend to think about it in a much more linear way from my experience. And I feel like that creates like an abusable situation, especially if your character has good air mobility. So for example, one thing I've been doing recently when I was playing Sea Viper is against modern players, I would just do this over and over again. I actually had a modern player. I won't post the clip because it's a little bit bullying, but against the modern player, I literally spent an entire round just doing this. And every single time that happened, because they are so used to having the one button anti-air kind of take care of the mental stack, you can just keep doing this sometimes and they don't really adjust from my experience. I mean, this also works in Classic. You can definitely get away with stuff like this in Classic. But I feel like it works even better against modern players because, like I said, they tend to not vary their DP timing much. And they just kind of do see a jump, press the anti-air, that's it, you know? If you don't have a move that changes your air trajectory, another thing you can do to kind of like punish modern DPs is you can actually abuse certain cross-up angles. Because modern players tend to, like I said, they DP with a very specific timing, and if you jump at them from certain deep cross-up angles, like kind of about here-ish, a lot of the time this will happen. They tend to not delay the DP, especially when cross-cutting. And again, this doesn't apply to every modern player. Some modern players can do a very late DP. But yeah, a lot of modern players at this kind of deep cross-up angle will DP the wrong way because they aren't used to like cross-cutting in the traditional sense. So again, even if you don't have a way to change your trajectory, this angle can be nasty for modern players. Anyway, the final tip I want to give you guys for modern players is general passivity. So I mentioned this earlier, but I want to kind of highlight it because modern offers so many reactive answers to common approaches like fireball, like I don't know, drive rush, like jumping, that it kind of creates a lot of modern players who get conditioned into a purely reactive playstyle. So I don't know if you guys have encountered players like this, but they're quite common. Modern players who don't really know how to take the initiative. They just wait for you to throw yourself at them and pick the appropriate response from their like lineup of specials. So a huge part of countering modern is being able to force interactivity with your opponent. And the most important skill for that is this. This is not flashy. This is what optimal anti-modern gameplay looks like. Ready? That. Walk block. It's the most important tool in your entire arsenal against modern players. You need to be able to just walk them down. Walking forward and blocking is so useful against modern players because they're waiting for you to do something high risk, like a jump, like, I don't know, this. They're waiting for you to throw yourself at them, but walking forward and slowly just bulldogging them down to the corner. This alone, honestly, I've run into modern players who just completely crumble purely by just doing walk-up block because they're forced to take the initiative and they aren't really experienced in taking the initiative because they're so used to playing reactively. Alright, anyway, I hope this video was useful, hope these tips were useful, and I will see you guys all in the next video.